Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the F.A. Berry Training Institute LGBTQIA Inclusion segment. I am your host for the next couple of hours, Warren Alexander O'Meara Dates, and I am the founder, CEO of the 652 Project Foundation, founded in Gadsden, Alabama in 2010. This program is funded wholly or in part by the government of the District of Columbia, the Department of Health, HIV/AIDS, Hepatitis, STI, and TB Administration, better known as HAHSTA. Today, for our subject matter, we have three learning objectives. One, we're going to learn how to define our culture, and our being, yes, I am a member of the LGBTQIA community, and we're going to understand what our language is all about. We're also going to discuss cultural humility, and we're going to learn how to check our own individual personal biases. And then lastly, I want to help you understand how we can improve the LGBTQIA community's involvement in accomplishing the mission of organizational programming. So how then do we do all of this? First, we have to tackle it by understanding a little bit about the community itself. And by so, we want to learn a few definitions. So cultural humility is where I'm going to start. Define what it means in the context of this presentation, Warren. Well, for me, it means that we include our self-examination, and it's a refinement of our awareness, of our own behavior, of our attitudes, and our knowledge about others. That, to me, is a life of process learning. It's also a self-examination on the interplay of what I call the two P's, and those two P's being our power and our privilege. LGBTQ. What does that really mean? Well, there really is a word for that. So for the L, we've got lesbian. For G, gay. B, bisexual. T, transgender. And Q could be interchangeable. It could either be queer or questioning. Queer. I think I've heard that word before, right? Well, let me help you with that. So now in 2020, you may feel that that's a term that any and everyone can use. And it's true if in the context of a millennial or a Gen Zer, because they have taken back or reclaimed, if you will, the term. But I want to take you back to my time of growing up as a person identifying in community. And if you use the term queer in the 80s and 90s, it was a little bit more of a derogatory term. So be careful not to assume that when you're speaking to someone whom you may think is a part of the LGBTQ community, that you first identify and allow them to identify how they want to be labeled. Label's a word that we really don't like to use, but in this context, I will allow for it, if you will. So our sexual identity, what is that? When we say sexual identity or sexual orientation, as you may have heard it, we're talking really about the ways that we categorize ourselves and define who we are attracted to. And for me, that's three things. We are either attracted to someone romantically, sexually, or otherwise. And within the context of our community, the L, the G, and the B all represent sexual identities. So the lesbian, the gay, and the bisexual individual are really identifying themselves based on their romance, their sex, or otherwise. Sexual identity, however, and gender identity are not the same thing. And so that brings us to our transgender or trans brothers and sisters. It's an umbrella term for people whose gender identity may or may not be the same sex that they were assigned at birth. The term transgender is not, and I emphasize the word not here, indicative of someone's hormonal makeup, their physical anatomy, how they may be perceived in their daily lives, their sexual identity, or their gender expression. Because the way in which we refer to people sometimes may be stigmatizing and may be some inappropriate language. For example, when we're talking about our transgender community, we're not supposed to use terms like a transgender, a transgendered, transgenderism, or transgenders. These are examples of ways we certainly don't want to describe someone in the trans identity, particularly because it's not appropriate, but it's also not necessarily welcoming. Transgender should be used as an adjective and not as a noun. So now that we've kind of defined what the LGB and the T are, let's talk about gender in the binary sense of our society. So society says that there are two genders only. Well, we know that's not true, male and female, right? But one's sense of their internal being would be their gender identity. You know, there are many of us in this world who actually have an identity of gender that may or may not be male, female, neither of these, both, or it could be other genders. What we know to be true is that everyone has a gender identity. And so in most of our society, we consider the straight people or cisgender in the context of true term. It's an adjective for someone who exclusively identifies themselves with the sex that they were assigned at birth. Note, this in most cases would not be someone who is transgender. So then what do we mean by non-binary? Non-binary would be an umbrella term that we use for gender identity for someone who defines themselves as being either female or male, woman or man, but it also could be someone who identifies themselves as neither. What would be an example of this, you would say? Well, for me, I would say, that could be Jesse is a non-binary person. By that, I mean, not all non-binary people identify themselves as trans, and not all trans people identify themselves as non-binary, because not all binary people are going to be considered cis. They also may call themselves queer. Identity commonly used by people who do not identify themselves or express their gender within the gender binary is what we would call genderqueer. Those who identify as genderqueer may identify as neither strictly masculine nor feminine. They may feel restricted by the gender labels of male or female. Other terms that you may hear around genderqueer could be gender fluid, gender nonconforming, or gender creative. And more often than not, we refer to people within the community as people are of the GNC community. So therefore the term gender nonconforming. So now that we've understood the gender identity piece, let's talk about gender expression. Our gender expression is our physical expression of our identity through some of our following: our clothing, our hairstyle, our voice, our body shape. And not all of those expressions may be safe to express in ways that feel authentic for many reasons, including our safety. For example, you may have someone who is a part of the LGBTQ community who's a part of your work culture, that for whatever reason that they feel your culture is not welcoming, they may not be able to bring their whole selves to work in the way that they would truly want to express themselves through clothing, hairstyle, voice, etc., because they don't feel inclusion within the space. And so we then want to make sure that we're always open to allowing people to be expressive within their own rights. So gendered language, let's avoid using that if at all possible when it's not necessary, right? We want to talk to people in inclusionary language. People first language is what I call it. It's partner or spouse, not wife or husband, because not everyone refers to themselves in the male or female context. Are we getting it now? We talk to people as people, folks, that's what we used in the South, right? Or everyone. And then we really come down South and we talk about, hey, y'all. That's a term that we use as a term of endearment, because it's also an inclusionary term that we use for people, and it doesn't gender them at the same time. Our friends over at Mama Bear Apologetics really broke this thing down for us. The gingerbread man, gingerbread woman, gingerbread they, right? So think of it in this context. Identity. In your brain, it's how you, in your head, experience and define your gender. It's based on how much you align or don't with what you understand the options of gender to be. Your heart, or your attraction. It's how you find yourself feeling drawn or not to some other people in sexual, romantic, and or other ways, often categorizing your gender. Then that piece of anatomy that's down between your legs is the physical traits you're born with or develop that we think of as sex characteristics, right? As well as the sex you were assigned at birth. And then finally, that wing up under that arm or the outside layer that we always present to everybody is our expression. It's how we present our gender through our actions, our clothing, our demeanor, and those are just to name a few. And how those presentations are viewed are based on our social expectations. So now, when we talk about community, there are ways that we talk to community through pronouns. We identify ourselves based on how we want others to communicate with us, right? So when you're approaching someone that you may perceive to be of community, it's best to ask them what their pronouns are rather than making an assumption. Because we all know when we make assumptions, there's a good outcome that we don't necessarily want to have, right? So you would ask someone, what's your name? Or what are your pronouns? We want to recognize that people's pronouns may also change from time to time. This morning, I may refer to myself as he. But in the afternoon or evening, depending on the space that I may be a part of, I may consider myself to be a they. Let's talk about what pronouns are. So in the societal context, we have feminine pronouns, we have masculine pronouns. But to take it further, we in the community have gender neutral pronouns as well. So feminine pronouns would be considered she, her. Masculine would be he, him. Gender neutral would be they, them. Also, sie, zir, sie, here, right? And you can see on the screen that there are many examples of how to use those in the context. I want you to pay, however, particular attention to the bottom. It says, I'm seeking Jeremy this weekend, or I'm seeing Jeremy this weekend. They're going to take me skateboarding. Then I'm going to go with them to the movies. And then there's a response. Brittany brought me to this awesome concert. Z is so much fun. I can't wait to hang out with Zir again. So you get that present, past participles, right? That's kind of how you translate the pronouns. And so based on someone's identity is how they would perceive themselves to be expressed through their pronouns. What we don't want to do is get in the habit of misgendering people. Again, back to that word assumption that we talked about a few moments ago. If and when, for whatever reason, you misgender someone, let me make a note. You make a mistake, you apologize quickly, and you move on. Never make someone feel like you're owed an apology or you trying to explain yourself to them is necessary, because people of community understand that this may or may not be new to you, right? And so as a result, we will correct you, we will help you understand better, and we're ready to move on. But please don't put us in a position to where we feel like we have to defend who we are simply because you didn't take the time to educate yourself about who we are. So as we get ready to take this train on down to the station, one of the things that I feel it's very important that we talk about is inappropriate language. We kind of talked about it a little bit when we were referring to our trans experience friends, but I also want you to think of it in the context of all of the LGBTQIA rainbow. We don't, as a society, want to refer to anyone in this community as a sexual preference. That's an outdated term that's now been replaced with what we examine as sexual identity. You also do not want to get caught up in calling someone who identifies in community that they're a lifestyle. The phrase gay lifestyle is often used when men who have sex with men or same gender loving men have an expression of saying that they're gay. A lifestyle is something that you choose in terms of going on a vacation. But being gay is not something that we've chosen. It's what we were born to be. Then homosexual, very derogatory term back in the South. In particular, I know that other parts of our country have used the term as well, but it was one that was very hurtful personally to me by assumptions from others when my identity was never even homosexual. My identity was bisexual all along. It's another outdated term that's now replaced with gay, queer, and in some cases other terms. So why does all of this matter? LGBTQ individuals exist first and foremost, and we are not all the same. As we start to examine our own biases, our beliefs, and our attitudes towards the LGBTQ community, and we open up to understanding that they are people just like everyone else, then we will understand the community much better. We also want an understanding that we have to respect community, because when we do, it fosters real connection to community. And as a result of fostering real connections, we then have a willingness to affirm spaces that will contribute to a reduction in stigma and discrimination. There's nothing more powerful than allowing someone to bring their whole selves to work every day. We all should have the space and the place to be able to be ourselves everywhere we go, including work. And then lastly, it matters because when we build sustainability, it allows us to share power, and it allows community to feel empowered to share knowledge for the success of our organizations. How do we then get there? We have to be open to education from community members. If you don't understand something about the LGBTQ community, it's okay to ask. We're very welcoming. We're very happy to educate. We want you to invite yourselves to share openly with us when you say or do something that may be upsetting, right? Because we're going to tell you when we're upset. So if we say something that you're uncomfortable with, let's have a conversation about it, and vice versa. If we say something that you don't understand, please feel that it's okay to ask questions, because we know that an informed community is always a better community. And then we want that community as people in community and in workspaces, that we're making an active effort to use language and terms that demonstrate inclusion, because no one wants to feel like they're not welcome in any space, particularly in the workspace. We want to ask individuals their names and their pronouns. And so when we do that, not only just at work, but when we do it at home as an everyday practice, then it becomes a normal. So when you're at home with your spouse, with your children, with your family, take the time to practice asking them what their pronouns are and helping them to identify themselves, so that when you then interact with LGBTQ colleagues, it doesn't feel so unnatural or so uncommon to you. And then lastly, have a genuine willingness to address the fact that you may not have experience with all this information, but you're committed to educating yourself and others. This concludes the portion of my program. At this point in time, I'm going to open up the session for some questions, and certainly would welcome any that you may have.